The New Zealand Army is the land component of the New Zealand Defence Force and comprises around 4,500 regular force personnel, 2,000 Territorial Force personnel and 500 civilians, formerly the New Zealand Military Forces. The current name was adopted by the New Zealand Army Act 1950. The New Zealand Army traces its history from settler militia raised in 1845. New Zealand soldiers served with distinction in the major conflicts in the 20th century, including the Second Boer War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Malayan Emergency, Borneo Confrontation and the Vietnam War. Since the 1970s, deployments have tended to be assistance to multilateral peacekeeping efforts. Considering the small size of the force, operational commitments have remained high since the start of the East Timor deployment in 1999. New Zealand personnel also served in the First Gulf War, Iraq and are currently serving in several UN and other peacekeeping missions. They have just been withdrawn from East Timor RAMSI in the Solomons and Afghanistan. History. The Musket Wars settlement and the New Zealand Wars War had been an integral part of the life and culture of the Maori people. The Musket Wars dominated the first years of European trade and settlement. The first European settlers in the Bay of Islands formed a volunteer militia from which some New Zealand Army units trace their origins. British forces and Maori fought in various New Zealand wars starting in the north of the country in 1845, and culminating in major campaign in the Waikato in the mid-1860s, during which settler forces were used with great effect. Towards the end of the war, the numbers of British troops were reduced, leaving settler units to continue the campaign. The first permanent military force was the Colonial Defence Force, which was active from 1862. This was replaced in 1867 by the Armed Constabulary, which performed both military and policing roles. After being renamed the New Zealand Constabulary Force, it was divided into separate military and police forces in 1886. The military force was called the Permanent Militia and later renamed the Permanent Force. Major Alfred William Robin led the first contingent sent from New Zealand to South Africa to participate in the Boer War in October 1899. The New Zealand Army sent 10 contingents in total, of which the first 6 were raised and instructed by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Henry Banks, who led the 6th contingent into battle. These were mounted riflemen, and the first contingents had to pay to go, providing their own horses, equipment and weapons. The Defence Act 1909, which displaced the old volunteer system, remodeled the defences of the Dominion on a territorial basis, embodying the principles of universal service between certain ages. It provided for a territorial force, or fighting strength, fully equipped for modern requirements, of 30,000 men. These troops, with the Territorial Reserve, formed the first line, and the second line comprised rifle clubs and training sections. Under the terms of the Act, every male, unless physically unfit, was required to take his share of the defense of the Dominion. The Act provided for the gradual military training of every male from the age of 14 to 25, after which he was required to serve in the reserve up to the age of 30. For the age of 12 to 14, every boy at school performed a certain amount of military training, and on leaving, was transferred to the senior cadets, with whom he remained, undergoing training, until 18 years of age, when he joined the Territorials. After serving in the Territorials until 25, and in the reserve until 30, a discharge was granted, but the man remained liable under the Militia Act to be called up until he reached the age of 55. As a result of Lord Kitchener's visit to New Zealand in 1910, Slight alterations were made, chiefly affecting the general and administrative staffs, and which included the establishment of the New Zealand Staff Corps, and the scheme was set in motion in January 1911. Major General Sir Alexander Godley, of the Imperial General Staff, was engaged as Commandant. World War I. In World War I, New Zealand sent the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, of soldiers who fought with Australians as the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps at Gallipoli, subsequently immortalised as Anzacs. A New Zealand division then formed which fought on the Western Front, and the New Zealand Mounted Rifles Brigade fought in Palestine. After Major General Godley departed with the New Zealand Expeditionary Force in October 1914, Major General Alfred William Robin commanded New Zealand military forces at home throughout the war, as Commandant. The total number of New Zealand troops and nurses to serve overseas in 1914 to 1918, excluding those in British and other Dominion forces, was 100,000. From a population of just over 1 million, 42% of men of military age served in the NZDF. 16,697 New Zealanders were killed and 41,317 were wounded during the war, a 58% casualty rate. Approximately a further 1,000 men died within 5 years of the war's end, as a result of injuries sustained, and 507 died whilst training in New Zealand between 1914 and 1918. New Zealand had one of the highest casualty and death rates per capita of any country involved in the war. World War II. In World War II, the 2nd Division fought in Greece, Crete, the Western Desert Campaign and the Italian Campaign. Among its units was the famed 28th Maori Battalion. Following Japan's entry into the war, 3rd Division 2 NZDFIP saw action in the Pacific, seizing a number of islands from the Japanese. New Zealanders contributed to various Allied Special Forces units, such as the original Long-Range Desert Group in North Africa and Z-Force in the Pacific, as part of the preparations for the possible outbreak of war in the Pacific. The defensive forces stationed in New Zealand were expanded in late 1941. On the 1st of November, 3 new brigade headquarters were raised, and 3 divisional headquarters were established to coordinate the units located in the northern, central and southern military districts. The division in the northern military district was designated the Northern Division and comprised the 1st and 12th Brigade groups. Northern Division later became 1st Division. 4th Division was established in the Central Military District, and 5th in the South. The forces stationed in New Zealand were considerably reduced as the threat of invasion passed. During early 1943, each of the 3 home defense divisions were cut from 22,358 to 11,530 men. The non-divisional units suffered even greater reductions. The New Zealand government ordered a general stand-down of the defensive forces in the country on the 28th of June, which led to further reductions in the strength of units and a lower state of readiness. By the end of the year, almost all of the Territorial Force personnel had been demobilized, and only 44 soldiers were posted to the 3 divisional and 7 brigade headquarters. The war situation continued to improve, and the 4th Division, along with the other 2 divisions and almost all the remaining Territorial Force units, was disbanded on the 1st of April 1944. The 6th New Zealand Division was also briefly formed as a deception formation by renaming the NZ Camp at Mahdi in southern Cairo, the New Zealanders' base area in Egypt, in 1942. In addition, the 1st Army Tank Brigade was also active for a time. Post-war, the New Zealand Army was formally formed from the New Zealand military forces following the Second World War. Attention focused on preparing a third expeditionary force potentially for service against the Soviets. Compulsory military training was introduced to man the force, which was initially division size. The New Zealand Army Act 1950 stipulated that the Army would consist from then on of Army troops, district troops, and the New Zealand Division, the Mobile Striking Force. The division was alternatively known as 3NZDF. The Army's first combat after the Second World War was in the Korean War, which began with North Korea's invasion of the South on the 25th of June 1950. After some debate, on the 26th of July 1950, the New Zealand government announced it would raise a volunteer military force to serve with the United Nations Command in Korea. The idea was opposed initially by Chief of the General Staff Major General Keith Lindsay Stewart, who did not believe the force would be large enough to be self-sufficient. His opposition was overruled and the government raised what was known as K-Force, a total of 1,044 men selected from among volunteers. 16th Field Regiment, Royal New Zealand Artillery and support elements arrived later during the conflict from New Zealand. The force arrived at Busan on New Year's Eve, and on the 21st of January, joined the British 27th Infantry Brigade. The New Zealanders immediately saw combat and spent the next 2.5 years taking part in the operations which led the United Nations forces back to and over the 38th parallel, later recapturing Seoul in the process. Through the 1950s, New Zealand Army forces were deployed to the Malayan Emergency and the confrontation with Indonesia. A special air service squadron was raised for this commitment, but most forces came from the New Zealand Infantry Battalion in the Malaysia-Singapore area. The battalion was committed to the Far East Strategic Reserve. The 1957 National Government Defense Review directed the discontinuation of coastal defense training, and the approximately 1,000 personnel of the 9th, 10th, and 11th Coastal Regiments Royal New Zealand Artillery had the compulsory military training obligation removed. A small cadre of regulars remained, but as Henderson, Green, and Cook say, the coastal artillery had quietly died. All the fixed guns were dismantled and sold for scrap by the early 1960s. After 1945, the Valentine tanks in service were eventually replaced by about 10 M41 Walker Bulldogs, supplemented by a small number of Centurion tanks. Eventually, both were superseded by FV-101 Scorpion armored reconnaissance vehicles. The New Zealand Division was disbanded in 1961, as succeeding governments reduced the force, first to 2 brigades, and then a single one. This one brigade force became, in the 1980s, the Integrated Expansion Force, to be formed by producing 3 composite battalions from the 6th Territorial Force infantry regiments. In 1978, a National Museum for the Army, the QE2 Army Memorial Museum, was built at Waiouru, the Army's main training base in the central North Island. After the 1983 Defense Review, the Army's command structure was adjusted to distinguish more clearly the separate roles of operations and base support training. There was an internal reorganization within the Army General Staff. A New Zealand Land Forces Command in Takapuna was split into a Land Force Command and a Support Command. Land Force Command, which from then on comprised 1st Task Force in the North Island and the 3rd Task Force in the South Island, assumed responsibility for operational forces, territorial force manpower management and collective training. Support Command, which from then on comprised three elements: the Army Training Group in Waiouru, the Force Maintenance Group based in Linton, and Base Area Wellington based in Trentham, assumed responsibility for individual training, third-line logistics and base support. Headquarters Land Force Command remained at Takapuna, and Headquarters Support Command was moved to Palmerston North. The Army was prepared to field a Ready Reaction Force, which was a battalion group based on 2/1 RNZII, the Integrated Expansion Force brigade-sized, which would be able to follow up 90 days after mobilization, and a force maintenance group of 19 units to provide logistical support to both forces. The battalion in Southeast Asia, designated 1st Battalion, Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment by that time, was brought home in 1989. In the late 1980s, Exercise Golden Fleece was held in the North Island. It was the largest exercise for a long period. For the 1960s, New Zealanders served in the Vietnam War, East Timor, and Afghanistan. New Zealand personnel have served in a large number of UN and other peacekeeping deployments, including the United Nations Truce Supervision Organization in the Middle East, Operation Agila in Rhodesia, the multinational force and observers in the Sinai, Cambodia, Somalia, Bosnia, Sierra Leone, Mozambique, Angola, Bosnia, Bougainville, with the Regional Assistance Mission to Solomon Islands, and the Sudan. In 2003, New Zealand decided to replace its existing fleet of M113 armored personnel carriers purchased in the 1960s, with the NZLAV, and the M113s were decommissioned by the end of 2004. An agreement made to sell the M113s via an Australian weapons dealer in February 2006 had to be cancelled when the US State Department refused permission for New Zealand to sell the M113s under a contract made when the vehicles were initially purchased. The replacement of the M113s with the General Motors LAV3 led to a review in 2001 on the purchase decision-making by New Zealand's Auditor General. The review found shortcomings in the defense acquisition process, but not in the eventual vehicle selection. In 2010, the government said it would look at the possibility of selling 35 LAVs, around a third of the fleet, as being surplus to requirements. On the 4th of September 2010, in the aftermath of the 2010 Canterbury earthquake, the New Zealand Defence Force deployed to the worst affected areas of Christchurch to aid in relief efforts and assist NZ Police in enforcing a nighttime curfew at the request of Christchurch Mayor Bob Parker and Prime Minister John Key. Commemorations. Anzac Day is the main annual commemorative activity for New Zealand soldiers. On the 25th of April each year, the landings at Gallipoli are remembered, though the day has come to mean remembering the fallen from all wars in which New Zealand has been involved. While a New Zealand public holiday, it is a duty day for New Zealand military personnel who, even if not involved in official commemorative activities, are required to attend an Anzac Day dawn parade in ceremonial uniform in the home location. Remembrance Day, commemorating the end of World War I on the 11th of November 1918, is marked by official activities with a military contribution, normally with parades and church services on the closest Sunday. However, Anzac Day has a much greater profile and involves a much higher proportion of military personnel. The various regiments of the New Zealand Army mark their own corps days, many of which are derived from those of the corresponding British regiments. Examples are Cambrai Day on the 20th of November for the Royal New Zealand Armoured Corps, St Barbara's Day on the 4th of December for the Royal Regiment of New Zealand Artillery, Current deployments. The New Zealand Army currently has 73 personnel deployed on 11 missions across 8 countries. Afghanistan 8 personnel. Sinai 23 personnel, as part of the multinational force and observers. In addition, small numbers of NZ personnel are deployed on various United Nations peacekeeping missions around the world. Dress. Uniforms of the New Zealand Army have historically followed the British Army uniform pattern. The high-crowned lemon squeezer hat was for decades the most visible national distinction. This was adopted by the Wellington Regiment about 1911 and became general issue for all New Zealand units during the latter stages of World War I. The different branches of service were distinguished by coloured puggarees or wide bands around the base of the crown. The lemon squeezer was worn to a certain extent during World War II, although often replaced by more convenient forage caps, berets, or helmets. British pattern battle dress was worn until the 1970s, with jungle greens being used as field wear. British DPM was adopted in 1980. Modern field wear is New Zealand disruptive pattern material camouflage, which closely resembles British DPM field uniforms. On overseas service, a New Zealand flag badge and a white kiwi on a circular black field with the words New Zealand are worn. The DPM uniform, with the addition of a beret or sometimes the mounted rifle's hat, is the usual working uniform and, accordingly, the one most commonly worn. On the 27th of July 2012, the New Zealand Army formally announced the new multi-terrain camouflage uniform will replace the NZDPM and NZDDPM patterns. It is intended that the MCU will be issued to all branches of the NZDF, with preliminary issue starting around mid-2013. In recent years, a number of distinctive New Zealand features have appeared, while at the same time corps and regimental distinctions have been reduced in favor of standardized items of dress for reasons of supply, rationalization and economy. The lemon squeezer, after being in abeyance since the 1950s, was reintroduced for ceremonial wear in 1977. Officer cadets and the New Zealand Army Band wear this headdress with a scarlet and blue full-dress uniform, a wide-brimmed khaki hat with green puggaree, of a pattern formerly worn by the New Zealand Mounted Rifle regiments, replaced the khaki No. 2. British Army peaked cap as service dress headdress for all branches in 1998. In 2012, it was announced that the MRH was to become the standard Army ceremonial headdress, with the lemon squeezer being retained only for colour, parties and other limited categories. The dark blue sashes worn by sergeants are now embroidered with a traditional Maori motif for mokowewe, denoting speed and agility. On the infantry sash, the mokowewe appears in black, white and red diagonal steps, and on that of the New Zealand Scottish, in green, black and white. Short Maori cloaks are sometimes worn by senior officers as a mark of distinction on occasions of special ceremony, though they are not part of the regulation uniform. Until 2002, berets were in various colors according to branch or unit. Since then, under a one beret policy, rifle green has become the universal color for this headdress, except for the sand brown of the Special Air Service. The British infantry pattern mess uniform is still worn by officers and senior NCOs for formal evening occasions. A universal pattern comprising scarlet mess jackets and blue-black trousers has replaced the various regimental and corps mess dress uniforms previously worn. The universal mess dress has also replaced the white jacket and black barathea trousers previously worn in summer or tropical climates. The dark blue No. 1 dress, formerly worn by officers before the general adoption of mess uniforms, was last worn in the early 1990s, although it was nominally retained for wear by the Chief of Army on appropriate state occasions. Highland orders of dress are authorised for wear by the New Zealand Scottish Squadron of the RNZAC at the discretion of the squadron commander. They are also authorised for the pipes and drums of the 5th Battalion Group. Structure. The New Zealand Army is commanded by the Chief of Army, who is a Major General, a 2-star appointment. The current Chief of Army is Major General Dave Gaughan. The Chief of Army has responsibility for raising, training and sustaining those forces necessary to meet agreed government outputs. For operations, the Army's combat units fall under the command of the Land Component Commander, who is on the staff of the COMJFNZ at Headquarters Joint Forces New Zealand at Trentham in Upper Hutt. Forces under the Land Component Command include the 1st Brigade and 1 NZ Shash Group. No. 3 Squadron RNZAF provides tactical air transport support. Land Training and Doctrine Group Land Operations Training Center Waiuru encompasses the main Army trade schools, combat schools, School of Artillery, Logistics Operations Schools, School of Tactics, Royal New Zealand School of Signals, School of Military Intelligence and Security Trade Training School, School of Military Engineering, 2 Engineer Regiment. Regiments and Corps of the Regular Army, Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment, New Zealand Special Air Service, Royal New Zealand Armoured Corps, Royal Regiment of New Zealand Artillery, Corps of Royal New Zealand Engineers, Royal New Zealand Corps of Signals, Royal New Zealand Army Logistic Regiment, Royal New Zealand Army Medical Corps, Royal New Zealand Army Nursing Corps, Royal New Zealand Army Dental Corps, Corps of Royal New Zealand Military Police, New Zealand Intelligence Corps, Joint Services Fire Training School, New Zealand Army Band, Army Reserve, the Territorial Force, the long-established reserve component of the New Zealand Army, has as of 2009-2010 been renamed the Army Reserve, in line with other Commonwealth countries, though the term Territorial Force remains the official nomenclature in the Defence Act 1990. It provides individual augmentees and formed bodies for operational deployments. There are reserve units throughout New Zealand, and they have a long history. The modern Army Reserve is divided into 6 regionally based battalion groups. Each of these is made up of smaller units of different specialities. The terms regiment and battalion group seem to be interchangeably used, which can cause confusion. However, it can be argued that both are accurate in slightly different senses. In a tactical sense, given that the reserve units are groupings of all arms, the term battalion group is accurate, though usually used for a much more single-arm heavy grouping. 3 infantry companies plus 1 armoured squadron. For example, NZ Reserve battalion groups are composed of a large number of small units of different types. The term regiment can be accurately applied in the British regimental system sense, as all the subunits collectively have been given the heritage of the former NZ infantry regiments. TF regiments prepare and provide trained individuals in order to top up and sustain operational and non-operational units to meet directed outputs. TF regiments perform the function of a training unit, preparing individuals to meet prescribed outputs. The 6 regiments command all Territorial Force personnel within the region except those posted to Formation Command Headquarters. Military Police Company, Force Intelligence Group 1 New Zealand Special Air Service services regiment. At a minimum, each regiment consists of a headquarters, a recruit induction training company, at least one rifle company, and a number of combat support or combat service support companies or platoons. 3/1 of a Stone Battalion, Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment, previously existed on paper as a cadre. If needed, it would have been raised to full strength through the regimentation of the Territorial Force infantry units. Army plans now envisage a 3-maneuver unit structure of 1 RNZIR-QAMR and 2/1 RNZIR, being brought up to strength by TF individual and subunit reinforcements. The New Zealand Cadet Corps also exists as an Army-affiliated youth training and development organisation, part of the New Zealand Cadet Forces. A rationalisation plan to amalgamate the then existing 6 reserve regiments to 3, and to abolish 1/3 of reserve personnel posts, had been mooted for some years. This was finally agreed by the New Zealand government in August 2011, and was implemented in 2012. The Territorial Forces Employer Support Council is an organisation that provides support to reserve personnel of all 3 services and their civilian employers. It is a national organisation appointed by the Minister of Defence to work with employers and assist in making reserve personnel available for operational deployments.